And then he says that ultimately we have a long-term game. And he says that most of the people involved in the Cold War espionage machinations and whatnot, they don't even know the long-term goals of the rules of the game and the Atlanticist American power bloc, what they wanted to achieve. And you're going to be blown away when I get to who he says to go read to understand the long-term game plan. But he does say, quote, that ultimately this is about bringing in a global brotherhood of man, a new order of the ages, and a new order of the world. And he says, if you want to understand how we got to that, he says, realize that out of the two world wars, the U.S. got transformed into USA World Police. Everybody knows about Team America. Remember that old satire? That's actually out of CIA writings and CIA manuals. Miles Copeland himself said that the U.S. was engineered into a world police model where they would be the enforcers of the inner deep state core who wanted to use America as the engine of the NWO. And he even specifically says that the United States took over the old Pax Britannia. Remember how often have we talked about the concession of the British imperial model, the Pax Britannia, to the Pax Americana. Now, remember, the Pax Americana is not ultimately the will of the American people. Okay, we're not talking about America's bad in itself. It's actually the corrupt inner military-industrial complex corporate elite, who, by the way, are going to be explained in Alex Abea's book, Soldiers of Reason, when he gives a separate section about this game center being the real Iron Mountain. So notice you have to kind of cross-reference these two books to notice this, that the report from Iron Mountain is satire, but it's based on the real game center model that Alex Abella will explain precisely in what way is real. We'll see that here in a minute. This is the Alex Jones Show, the only place where you see this kind of information broken down. Don't go anywhere. Stay where you are. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm your guest host for this fourth hour, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis, and also of the YouTube channel, Jay Dyer, and also of the Rockfin channel, Jay Dyer. Great free speech-based platform. And of course, also here at Band.video or Battleplan.news. You can also find all kinds of excellent cutting-edge information here. So be sure to keep putting out those links and that information. You know, in my fourth hour, typically what we do is we get into really hardcore lectures about the deep plans of the elite. We always go through books. We always go through the real writings of the elite. And that's so key to do because there's still skeptics out there. There's still people that can be awakened through understanding that all of this information is already out there in the public domain. You just have to know where to go and where to look. One of the ways that we know this is not just from the globalist white papers and that kind of thing, which is very important, but a lot of people don't know about the spy biographies that are out there. A lot of spies later on in their life, as they were getting into the latter years, the twilight years, they would write down all of their escapades. And while it's true that we can't take everything that they said at face value, even if half of what they write or 75% of what they write is the case, we can get a real key insight into the operations of these busybodies and busy bees of the elite. One of the best spy biographies that I've read is the very rare, hard to find. It took me many years to get a hold of a copy of this, and that is the book Game of Nations by Miles Copeland. This is the Copeland that you may recognize from the Police. Now, it's that family. Now, Stuart Copeland is from the Police, but he's a relative of Miles Copeland, the famous CIA operative. And this Game of Nations book is a fascinating insight into his escapades during the Cold War in both Syria and Egypt. Now, he did most of his operations in Egypt. He didn't spend all of his time in Syria. He did a few things in Syria, and then he went on to work in Egypt with Nasser. Now, I'm not going to be going into a lot of the history of the Cold War and all that. Mainly what we want to focus on in this amazing book, this amazing tell-all, is the overall globalist elite plan that is totally admitted in the book. We want to look at the strategies of revolution, how to engineer, how to steer revolutionary movements, how to control chaos, managed chaos, arc of crisis type model, and how ultimately this ties into long-term plans that the corporate global elite had, in this case for Egypt, but in the long term, it's a model for the whole world. So remember, this is going to be a microcosm of the CIA operations that were done, according to Miles Copeland, in Egypt with Nasser. And then how we can see that as a zoom out, that's exactly what they do now. It's exactly the siege chaos model that the same power entity, the same group, is enacting in our country. The U.S. is undergoing the exact same models and strategies of attempting to collapse and a controlled collapse of the country, not just for chaos, but to bring in the new order, to bring in the phoenix from the ashes, order out of chaos. Now, Miles Copeland begins his book by saying that we call this the peace game, this game of nations. Remember Brzezinski's grand chessboard model, his book of how we have the players, the people, the presidents. There are pieces on the chessboard that we move around. And he says, you may have heard of this famous, believed to be a conspiracy text called the Report from Iron Mountain. Yeah, actually, Miles Copeland starts his book out by talking about the Report from Iron Mountain. And why would he do that? Well, he says, everybody kind of thinks about this. It was printed as a kind of a satire. But he says, did you know that this was actually based on a real thing? He says it was based on the CIA Games Center, aka Game Theory, Game of Nations. And he says that I'm going to explain in this book how I played the Game of Nations, how I was engaged in this consultation level at a high level as a liaison between the CIA under the cover of a private consulting firm, telling and advising Nasser what to do. He says even controlling the periods, managing the periods when Nasser appeared to be anti-US, he'll say. Now, the first thing he says is that let me tell you the rules of the Game of Nations. The number one rule is that it's not about morals. There's no morals in this game at all. It is purely about winners. Winning, hashtag winning. remember Charlie Sheen is pure tiger blood. Winners and losers, that's it. He says, we assume that a nation state, for example, will operate in terms of maximizing power and minimizing personal loss. He says that's the way that we'll manipulate the leaders of the other countries. In this case, it'll be Nasser. He says that we assume moral relativism. So remember that in the game of geopolitical public, international sphere, it's not about right and wrong. It's not about morals. Morals only come in when you want to call somebody out and make them look bad, right? Virtue signaling. And a key section next is that he says, we were actually experimenting at this time. Get this is pretty wild. And he wrote this book in 1969. Okay, so Copeland wrote this in 1969. He says, we began experimenting with computer-generated models of decision information and game theory devised by the RAND Corporation. So in other words, Egypt, he says, was a test bed for the RAND Corporation running game theory, Herman Kahn, rational choice theory models on Egypt. And he says that we would put all this information into this old ass computer, this old computer, right? Like a something out of an old movie. And he said it would spit out what would be our best objectives in these situations. Now that's amazing because I don't think most people think about using computer information back that long ago in the 1960s. But he says that that's what the CIA Games Center was involved in. He says, next of all, you have to understand that we're purely pragmatic in this process. We're not guided by any ideology other than winning. And that's why he says in the Game of Nations, we must reduce our approach to pure pragmatism, will to power, and lying. He says that this is the strategy and technique of regime change. He says that regime change and control of nations is a zero-sum game. He says that in the original process of this with Nasser, he says we had to pay him off $50 to $60 million. He says ultimately it was about partly the control of the Suez Canal. Copeland claims to have been a key figure in that. And then he says that ultimately we have a long-term game. And he says that most of the people involved in the Cold War espionage, machinations, and whatnot, they don't even know the long-term goals of the rules of the game and the Atlanticist American power bloc, what they wanted to achieve. And you're going to be blown away when I get to who he says to go read to understand the long-term game plan. But he does say, quote, that ultimately this is about bringing in a global brotherhood of man, a new order of the ages, and a new order of the world. And he says, if you want to understand how we got to that, he says, realize that out of the two world wars, the U.S. got transformed into USA World Police. Everybody knows about Team America. Remember that old satire? That's actually out of CIA writings and CIA manuals. Miles Colton himself said that the U.S. was engineered into a world police model where they would be the enforcers of the inner deep state core who wanted to use America as the engine of the NWO. And he even specifically says that the United States took over the old Pax Britannia. Remember how often have we talked about the concession of the British imperial model, the Pax Britannia, to the Pax Americana. Now, remember, the Pax Americana is not ultimately the will of the American people. Okay, we're not talking about America's bad in itself. It's actually the corrupt inner military industrial complex corporate elite, who, by the way, are going to be explained in Alex Abea's book, Soldiers of Reason, when he gives a separate section about this game center being the real Iron Mountain. So notice you have to kind of cross-reference these two books to notice this, that the report from Iron Mountain is satire, but it's based on the real game center model that Alex Abella will explain precisely in what way is real. We'll see that here in a minute. This is the Alex Jones Show, the only place where you see this kind of information broken down. Don't go anywhere. Stay where you are. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. You'll notice right there, if you go to my YouTube channel, I just did a excellent discussion with old Eddie Bravo. So Eddie went pretty wild in this discussion that we had. If you want to go check that out, you can see that at my website, or you can head over to YouTube, and that will take you to the full discussion over on Eddie's page, which was his show ultimately. But we had a lot of fun, and it was a wild show. So definitely go check out that. I mean, we got into everything, and of course Eddie does his Eddie Goes Wild type of thing. So it's a lot of fun. It was a hilarious conversation. So check that out. Now, we were discussing Miles Copeland's famous book, The Rare Game of Nations text, and he was describing what the U.S. plan was back in the Cold War for the Middle East. And he said our goal was to, quote, bring democracy to the Middle East. However, he says that this idea of bringing democracy included rigging the elections, staging coups, creating and causing revolutions. And he says, ultimately, the Truman Doctrine to the Marshall Plan and all of this was a faux democracy attempt to just regime change and remake the Middle East according to the policy of the U.S. and ultimately military-industrial complex, the big oil companies at that time. And he says that one way that we were so successful in this was rigging elections. He says that back in the 50s and 60s, we had the art of rigging the elections completely down, completely mastered, a voting scam. Now, maybe that's relevant to things that have happened, I don't know, in the last few years, or maybe going back to the stories of the unions and JFK and RFK. I mean, there's pretty famous movies even made about this. I remember watching Martin Scorsese's The Irishman, and Pacino is sitting there talking to De Niro, and they're talking about the union bosses helping to rig elections for a certain prominent candidate. I'm not really, my point is not to go after, I don't care about the whole politics of JFK. I'm just pointing out that this is a well-known old thing that especially people in the CIA seem to be very adept at. They seem to be very well trained at rigging elections. And if I recall, Roger Stone wrote a paper, or wrote an essay back a couple years ago when we had a big kerfluffle over elections, which I think he said the same thing, didn't he? He talked about how this is a well-known strategy to rig elections in foreign countries. And I'm just saying it's echoed in this famous CIA operative's biography. Now, you've heard me talk a lot about the Madison Avenue people and how the admin played a big role, right? Don Draper played a big role in being used in these kinds of operations for psychological warfare. And there's a whole chapter getting into pages 46, 47, 48, where he notes that a lot of the men out of Madison Avenue had perfected these techniques of control, both in the advertising world and back and forth in a kind of a symbiotic relationship between psychological warfare in wartime and advertising in Madison Avenue. And he said they just applied those techniques of manipulation. Just think about how everybody's manipulated through advertising, right? And then applying that to nationwide control. He says that, for example, the CIA fostered the coup in 1949 in Syria that brought in the military dictatorship in Syria at that time. He says that was one of the examples of a destabilization operation that we engineered to bring in a puppet dictator. He says ultimately, it's a game of conflict that we play. And he says, really, we weren't even that worried about the Soviets. We knew the moves the Soviets and the Chinese would make, and we really were just playing them off against each other and against ourselves and against our little puppet people at different times. Another fascinating section, he says, is that one thing that we wanted to do at that time in the 40s and 50s for the CIA operations in the Middle East was to find a Muslim Billy Graham. He says that the CIA had noted and figured out that the techniques of Billy Graham's evangelical message in the U.S. and in the West was very powerful in moving large swaths of people. So they really sought out a figure who could mobilize and motivate all of the Islamic ideology in the Middle East for what he calls what he called Arab nationalism. So at that time, before they wanted to go with more of a micronation chaos model of the Middle East, the CIA had at this time a plan for Arab nationalism. However, he says that we never really thought Arab nationalism would work due to the tribal conflicts in these areas. He said, but one thing we did do that we found was successful is that the CIA would profile for psycho leaders. Yes, you heard me right. Profile to find psychotic, narcissistic political puppets. Okay. Do you think that still goes on? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, we seem to be run by psychopathic, narcissistic, crazy people. And he says, get this. He says that in order to come to this conclusion, he says, we looked at a couple of philosophers that had helped us come to this hard reality. Bertrand Russell and James Burnham. You don't know, Burnham, of course, is the guy who wrote about the Managerial Society. I need to cover his book because that's one of the key texts of the elite in the 20th century. And that's about setting up basically a corporate model for everything. So the way that the CEO corporation model runs, let's just do that everywhere. Now, I'm not inherently opposed to the idea of organization and having systems or anything like that. That's not the point of my talk here. I'm not an anarchist. But the problem is that these are techniques used by completely ruthless people to not just have an ordered organization, but to have an organization with literal psychopaths at the top. I mean, that's literally, do you understand? He's telling you we profile to find complete psychopaths to run nations as puppets, and that's how we control. And of course, yeah, they're compromised, they're blackmailed, but now this has all come out, especially after the last couple of years with the Epstein stuff and all that blackmail. This is nothing new. Okay, this goes back to the Cold War. And he even says a couple times, we follow Bertrand Russell's model. And the easiest way to control a nation is to have psychopaths, psychotics, pedos, et cetera, complete loons in control. There's a little addendum side note. He mentions that, oh yeah, by the way, Operation Ajax, that was totally real. Now, remember, the CIA didn't, this wasn't declassified and admitted until many, many years later. And of course, if you talked about Operation Ajax, you're a conspiracy theorist, that's crazy. Well, eventually it gets declassified and admitted, but he was admitting it in 1969. So yeah, of course it is. And you'll usually find that controversial things like this, like remember the existence of the Bilderberg group, right? rarely admitted in U.S. Western media. Every now and then European media would kind of leak out that they admitted it existed. But if you talked about it, you were poo-pooed. It was crazy. You're a conspiracy theorist. Then as it starts to get known, well, yeah, of course it exists, but why is that a bad thing? And then it turns into, well, if you disagree, you're a bigot, you're evil, right? That's the gaslighting model of what these people do. Next section, get this. I did not expect this. He said that in order to plan our revolutions that we engineered, the coups that we engineered in Egypt, he says we're going to get into some of the most famous, how can I say this, degenerates that you probably have heard of, and their philosophy and their chaos, and implement that as a way to destabilize and destroy the existing traditional culture in Egypt. Now, I'm not going to care about the traditional classic Muslim culture in Egypt. That's not my point. But my point is that this is a technique of regime change. I want to show you that. Don't go anywhere. It's Alex Jones.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ultra 12, the highest quality B12 you're going to find on the market, has been sold out for many months, but now it's back in stock at InfoWarsStore.com. Now, in the next 45 seconds, I don't have time to get into vitamin B12, but do your own research and realize when it is organic, high quality vitamin B12, it energizes every other vitamin, mineral in your body and all of your hormones and so much more. Ultra 12 is incredible. You take it under the tongue, so it's better absorption into your body, and it is a game changer. InfoWarsStore.com has Ultra 12 back in stock, and despite the fact it's back in stock, and despite the fact it's going to sell it very quickly, it is 40% off for a limited time. So act now, fund the InfoWar, and experience the purest, highest quality B12 now at InfoWarsStore.com, or call toll-free 888-253-3139. Thank you all for your support. Now take action and get your bottle of Ultra 12.
Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer. We're talking about the microcosm example of the CIA operations in Egypt with Nasser that can be expanded to understand precisely what we're going through right now with the attempted destruction of the West, the U.S., to motivate it and move it to transform it into the Great Reset, New World Order, the next phase, or you could even say a business plan phase. And by the way, he will describe them like business plan phases, the way that they moved Egypt in the direction that they wanted to go. Now you might say, well, but isn't it great to bring democracy to Egypt? I mean, weren't those people oppressed under, probably Islamic law or something like this or whatever? But the problem is when you understand where they want to take Egypt in this scenario, it is far worse. And it's a microcosm model of what they're going to do for the West and for ultimately the whole world if we don't wake up and understand that this is what's really going on. It's not about all of the stuff that people get distracted by, all the silly stuff. This is the model. This is the technique. It's a strategy. And as I was saying, the first thing he says that we did was prime the pump for revolution in Egypt with Kinsey. Yes, degenerate, creeper, coomer, Alfred Kinsey and his pro-pedo approach. He said we applied the sexual revolution techniques of Kinsey to Egypt. And we fostered things like any of the radical groups, any of the most extreme groups, any of the weird sexual stuff. He says we imported Hollywood. So he says that movies were instrumental in changing Egypt, to modernize Egypt. And he says all we did was sell to the Egyptian people that they had been cheated out of Western prosperity and the Hollywood lifestyle of being James Bond and of being this and that. And he actually mentions that James Bond was sort of a key kind of iconic figure to convince the Egyptians that they had missed out on this. He says that the CIA made a coup deal with Nasser in this situation. So again, this is straight out of his techniques. This is not my conspiracy theorizing. This is the famous CIA operative explaining the techniques of revolutionizing Egypt, not to help it, because as you're going to see, he's going to be citing people like Bertrand Russell and the Rand Corporation, the Population Council, for the ultimate grand designs of Egypt. Now, you might say, okay, well, so they were stoking the fires of sexual revolution. So what? That was a big thing in the 50s and 60s. Okay, but that's not all they did. He says we went to the students, and he says we arranged fake student riots. Fake student riots. We sent out all kinds of revolutionary propaganda Have you heard? Maybe this is something similar to color revolution model. Of course it is. Rand Corporation back in the 60s was experimenting in all those student riots, studying the techniques of swarming, studying the techniques of mob psychology to roll out mobs in future sociological warfare. I mean, I think maybe we've seen this in the last 5 years all over the place, especially Trump speaking events, especially the way people act in riots, the way people act in political meetings, right? They intentionally stoke the fires of these things. Next thing he says that we had to do was we brought in military psychological warfare experts, people like Paul Leinenberger, who has a famous book on psychological warfare. That's kind of a classic that people read in the military. And he says that what we had to do was at all costs magnify every potential tension in the region, in the country. So between rich and poor, agitate every possible Marxist idea between rich and poor. Now, remember, of course, this wasn't, quote, Marx. All they were concerned with was the pragmatic power of agitating any potential conflict. He says between tribes. He says between men and women. So women's liberation, feminist theology, all of those things were instrumental in being promoted. Sexual liberation. And he says some of these techniques, he says, were used by the Nazis from Paperclip. He says that people like Otto Skorzeny, they were involved in training a lot of people, the famous Nazi, the Galen Network, not just to training people in terms of espionage and spycraft, but also that the CIA reached out and was interested in these people training networks of assassins, networks of spies. And he says eventually the CIA ended up condoning Nasser, working with him because they felt that they had mastered mob psychology through immense amounts of research that the CIA put into studying public opinion. And he says that we had to utilize all of Paul Leinenberger's techniques that he mastered for the Pentagon about black propaganda, gray propaganda, white propaganda. All of that was rolled out in Egypt. And get this, what have you heard me say for so long? Warfare, Cold Warfare, theaters of war are giant test tubes. They're giant experiments. He says that a lot of what we were doing in Egypt was testing out social control models, testing out collapse models, testing out regime change models and techniques and strategies. He calls them a technology. So you have to understand this if you want to understand what's happening in America. It's not one random event to the next random event. This is a controlled, managed, chaotic, intended eventual collapse that's strategic in its phases and strategies. Remember all of the white papers that we saw that planned the SPARS pandemic, that planned out Clade X, that planned the 2020 to 2022 debacle that we've all lived through. Remember the Event 201. Remember, there's like 5 of these. Crimson Contagion. They're all related because it's the same people running the drills and the exercises to roll out this strategy. Now, that wasn't the first time that they rolled out big international scale psyops. The 9/11 event was a big international scale psyop. And that wasn't the first time that they had done it either. They had been testing and perfecting to a scientific degree these techniques, not just in Egypt with Nasser, but in in Vietnam with the Phoenix program. I just finished Douglas Valentine's book, Phoenix program. The whole situation in Vietnam is a big lab, a big test tube. Now, in the next section, Copeland goes on to say that first thing we realized we had to do was destroy Egyptian traditional society. Okay, we recommended Nasser participate in this, not because of anything to do with whether they believed or didn't like traditional society per se. I mean, there's an element of that. But he said that if we were ever going to integrate Egypt into a modern world, an industrialized, first world nation, what we would have to do is get them to that by destroying what came before. And things like Marxism, things like Muslim Brotherhood, things like anything like that Western intelligence agencies have co-opted and used at times are excellent for destroying everything that came before. This is why the OSS, Skull and Bones, and David Rockefeller supported the supported Mao's guerrillas. Okay, it had nothing to do with believing or not believing communism per se. It had to do with using it as a wrecking ball to destroy the wealth and the tradition and the history of the country, to solidify and consolidate all of the money and the power and the resources, and then transfer them offshore. That's it. That's what Marxism is. It's a tool of moneyed elite. The famous historian Oswald Spengler said that there's never been a socialist communist revolution that was not the tool of some money power. And that's 100% the case. So he says that we had to convince Nasser that he would have to be at the forefront of getting rid of traditional Egyptian society. We chose him as a actor. This is the words that are used, but he says he's a sort of an actor that we put up there as a kind of figurehead puppet. And he says that he would be the man who would revolutionize Egypt. And because he's a narcissist, he doesn't care about the people. He says, we're just using him. And after we vetted him, he says that we basically made him our man. He was our puppet. He says, in order to do this and pull this off, he says that we reached out to Arthur Little Consulting, and they came up with a 5-year plan to transform Egypt. Now, you might think, but again, isn't this good to bring Egypt into a modern society, to update it, to industrialize it? In itself, there's nothing wrong with that idea, but wait until you see what Miles Copeland says was the real reason that they wanted to modernize and industrialize Egypt. There's a whole chapter on it, and it has to do with offspring, has to do with babies. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm your guest host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. Now, we had mentioned at the beginning of this discussion that Miles Copeland says that the report from Iron Mountain, that famous classic sort of conspiracy idea that you can kind of get glimpses of in Dr. Strangelove, this idea of a deep state military industrial technocratic complex that would try to bring in a world government, that was by many people at the time lampooned as kind of a joke, and it was kind of put out as satire. However, we saw Copeland's book at the very beginning saying that it's actually based on a real thing. It's based on something akin to what's called the Gaither Report and the CIA Games Center. And if we go over to the book that we've covered in the past here on my fourth hour segments, which, by the way, if you're go to battleplan.news or band.video, you can type in my name and you'll see all the previous discussions that we've done. I try to make every fourth hour something like a very informative, sort of like a college class style lecture, if you will. So you can find all these past discussions there. And in this chapter in Abeo's book, he says that at this Gaither Report meeting, at the behest of the Rockefeller Foundation, there was a giant meeting that they had with a bunch of corporate elite, a bunch of CEOs, people from the Ford Foundation. They got together and said that we need to come up with a new National Security Council memorandum that would put in place a scenario where we could pursue a, quote, one world government that would eventually merge the United States into the Soviet Union. Now, at that time, that was in the Cold War, right? So there's this, right at the beginning of the Cold War, there's this dialectic going on. And in geopolitics at the time and up into the 90s, that became called the third way, the idea that we can blend Western capitalism with Eastern Bloc Sovietism. And out of that clashing, we'll get the thesis, the antithesis, the synthesis of the global order. And again, this is not a conspiracy text. This is a guy who was invited in for public approval, right? For public mainstream printing here for this book to explain what the Rand Corporation was all about. And on page 33, it notes that the goal of the Gaither Report and this National Security Council memorandum was the corporate elite telling the government that we want a one world government in the future. And we're going to get this out of the Cold War conflict. Abeo goes on to say that this was born out of the philosophy of full spectrum dominance. And this NSC 68 memorandum was based on the older Mackinder doctrine, right? Land power, sea power. Now, who was involved in all this exactly? What is this exactly? Well, he says that this was ultimately people out of the military-industrial complex. He says who we could identify as people from the Rand Corporation, like Volstetter, Herman Kahn, and Andrew Marshall. He says that this is people at this meeting from the CIA, people who were the chairman of CBS, people who headed up the Bay of Pigs invasion, people from MIT, people from Dutch Shell, at that time Shell Oil, people from other universities, John J. McCloy of Chase Manhattan Bank and the Council on Foreign Relations, the future president of the World Bank, Admiral Robert B. Carney of Westinghouse Electric, and many other Rand Corporation elites. Other companies were there, such as Sprague Electric. And basically, it was a big, as I said, Fortune 100 corporate elite. And they literally said, we want, at the behest of the Rockefeller Foundation, a global world order. This became known as the Gaither Committee Report. And that is precisely what the basis for the report from Iron Mountain is. So it's actually a real thing. And that's what this CIA operative says. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that in Miles Copeland's book, there was a not so nice reason as to why they wanted to industrialize and update Egypt. And it had to do with population. Can you guess what the overriding ideology of the same corporate elite at the Iron Mountain NSC 68 thing? Can you guess what their philosophy would be? What maybe Miles Copeland's philosophy would be? Could you guess? Do you have an idea? Maybe it has to do with everything that we've been talking about from all of these other global elite texts, right? Again, we've been through about 50 or 60 of them now over at my website and on my YouTube channel. There's a whole playlist, by the way. People go to the YouTube channel. Where is this? Where is this? There's a playlist there that lists all of the global elite writings that we've gone through. You can find that playlist. It's on the very front page right there. Well, this Arthur C. Little consulting plan was a 5-year model to introduce birth control and population control to Egypt. He says that when we decided that we would have to remove all of the old regime, we would do it in stages over many years to implement a new, updated Egypt that would accept abortion, other sexual things, and population control, birth control, etc. Attached to this was the rollout of Hollywood films and the morality of Hollywood films in Egypt. It's a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, all the way up to, get this, here it is. You see it right there? You can see it? You can see I'm not making this up. So if you want to pause that and screenshot it, you can go look and see that all this is real. Phase 2 would be, the phases lead up to the year 2000. The year 2000. By the year 2000, Egypt will be completely changed. And ultimately, a vastly changed population that by the end would begin to adopt depopulation. So the key element, I'm gonna one more thing before we close this out, which is, he says, another key element we had to bring in was the use of terror. Yes, terror, Western-controlled terror networks, rolling out the fake terrorists. Right? Not saying that there's not sometimes real terror. I mean, this is real terror, but in chapter 9, there's a famous section where he says that we in the CIA absolutely, totally have to use terror. We use terrorists. We use terror. Do you see this? Hello? Liars and deniers, can you read? We use terrorists. Next page. We use terrorists. We use terrorists. Does this make sense? Maybe this could help you figure out what happened on 9/11. Maybe a little bit. Maybe that's helpful. Maybe it's insightful. The West has a long history of using terrorists. He says that the terrorists were key in the coup. We planned out these coups in the Middle East. We also used organized crime, the mob. Have you heard me lecture on that? We use organized crime. We use organized crime, the mob in these regions. And ultimately, that helped us promote the renovation of the Middle East at that time that the CIA wanted. Now, what was the long-term goal, right? Was it to make a utopia? Was it to create this peaceful capitalist order in the Middle East? No. Wasn't any of that. Was it to create a communist utopia? No, it wasn't even that. Okay, wasn't any of that. He says, if you want to understand what the CIA operations in these countries in the Middle East at this time were all about, he says, I'm going to give you a reading list. He says, the first thing I want you to read is the CFR publications, the Council on Foreign Relations. Well, wait a minute. Does that exist? I mean, here's a CIA operative telling us to read the Council on Foreign Relations writings to understand what we are doing long term there. But does that exist? I mean, people out there, fact checkers. I mean, you guys tell us to dictate what's reality. So I guess I have to ask you if those things exist. Then he says, then you need to understand the writings of a guy named James Burnham. And James Burnham wrote books about the managerial society and technocracy and using the strategies of Taylorism, corporatism, and so forth to structure society as well. Then he says you should read a book called The True Believer that deals with things about controlling nations through the TV. And he mentions Sirhan Sirhan, okay, which again famously relates to MKUltra studies. Then he says you need to understand that we are guided by ecology. So he recommends some books on ecology and the green movement. Then he says you need to understand what we are planning to make the world by the year 2000. He says, go read Herman Kahn about the Rand Corporation. He says, because the Rand Corporation plans are ultimately to remake the world into a technocracy. Then he says you need to read Bertrand Russell. So he actually tells you to go read Bertrand Russell. He actually tells you to go read these people that you hear me talking about, because they are the ones that are crafting the New World Order, which is a technocracy premised on massive reduction of the population. And that was the ultimate goal of everything that they were doing in Egypt in the Cold War. And that's what he says is ultimately, if you want to zoom out, that's the plan that the elite, the Davos type people are going to do, not just for Egypt back then, but now the whole world in the U.S.
Whether you like it or not, you're in a war. The globalists think you're a piece of garbage that they want to exterminate. They want to make you as weak and as unhealthy as they can. They want to make you depressed. They want you to believe that you're not essential. You're made in the image of God. You are essential. And God gave us compounds that empower us and embolden us and energize us. And man, I got to tell you, Ultra 12 is a product I'm so proud of. It is the highest quality pharmaceutical grade vitamin B12 that energizes every other hormone and every other vitamin mineral in your body. It is essential. And that's why the food and the products the system sells are basically devoid of it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been sold out for close to 6 months, but Ultra 12 is back in stock. And again, this is the same pharmaceutical grade B12 people inject. Don't do that. Go to a doctor if you want it. There's even better absorption rate with that. But versus pills, this is the next best thing you're going to find. It's right below injections. And all you do is take a few drops every morning or every night, whenever you want. And people that taste it, they call us and they say, is there sugar in that? It doesn't say sugar in the bottle. No. Vitamin B12, real organic vitamin B12, tastes incredibly sweet, and it's a sweetness you've never experienced before. So listen, this could be salt water. This could be a placebo, and it'd be worth it because it funds the InfoWar, but it's not. It's high quality vitamin B12, Ultra 12 at InfoWarsStore.com, and it funds the operation. It's been sold out for months, but despite that, it's 40% off for a limited time. They'll go back to full price. Get your Ultra 12 vitamin B12 at InfoWars.com exclusively right now, and know you're funding the tip of the spear during this critical fight. Ultra 12 exclusively available at InfoWarsStore.com for 40% off.